Winston f***ing Churchill. Who is this man? What did he do? Well, the story we all know is the one of a man who heroically stood up to the horrors of Nazi Germany and ultimately led Britain to victory in the Second World War. His willingness to stand up against Hitler proved especially crucial from the years 1940 to 1943, when no other European leader did. A determined statesman and world-class public speaker, Churchill's wartime speeches have become cemented as some of the loudest and most inspiring promotions of freedom and democracy around the world. And yes, you could pick some holes in this story. You could point out that Britain's solitude against Germany was a little overstated. Australia and New Zealand declared war against Germany only a few hours after Britain did, and within a week, South Africa and Canada joined in too. Equally foolish would be the argument that we only have Stalin's Russia to thank, but nonetheless, they were involved too. You could also argue that it's a bit easier to persist in war when you command a global empire that provided over 2 million fighters from India, a third of a million from Africa, and 7,000 from the Caribbean. Others might even say that Churchill's stance against Hitler had nothing to do with anti-fascism and everything to do with protecting the British Empire. Leopold Amery, his Secretary of State for India during the war, said he couldn't see all that much difference between Churchill's worldview and Hitler's. But I don't care for this argument, because the difference is, when Churchill's side won, his people still had the freedom and power to vote him out. Which they did, by quite a big margin. You could even say that Churchill is more popular today than he was in 1945. And so he should be. If it weren't for him, we'd all be speaking German right now. Can you imagine? Because if there's one thing that made the prospect of a Nazi victory truly terrifying to British people, it was the idea of having to learn a second language. But seriously, I know full well that I'm able to sit here and speak freely in the Queen's without living in constant fear of Gestapo. For now. And I do kind of owe that, partly to my patrons, thank you very much, and partly to Winston Churchill. Because imagine what that was like. Standing up to a crazed tyrant who's already decimated half of Europe. All your colleagues are prepared to surrender, and your only ally within 1,000 miles is another crazed tyrant who, incidentally, was also guilty of ethnic cleansing. Look, it was the 40s, everyone was racist, and however racist Churchill was, it's still a good thing that his side won. And maybe the left and right can just kind of compromise on this World War II thing and see it as a sort of racist on racist violence. But, I hear some of you asking, why am I calling Churchill a racist? Well, Churchill was born in 1874, in a time when the British Empire commanded a quarter of the world. As a schoolboy, he was taught the very simple lesson that the superior white man was on a mission to conquer and civilize the barbaric, dark-skinned natives of faraway lands. Churchill eagerly accepted this idea and held on to it long after his contemporaries had deemed it a thing of the past. So there will be no "he was just a man of his time" bullshit in this house. He was a white supremacist, in the sense that he believed white people were superior and said it constantly. And at least once a year, the British media will ask itself a question something along the lines of, was Churchill a hero or a villain? A stupid question, of course, which always ends with one side talking about how he defeated Hitler and the other talking about how he terrorized millions of brown people. Every once in a while, this 6-foot pus deposit and his tragic political prisoner will invite a guest on for a 3-on-1 pay-per-view, like this one, which features a black man getting fondled by a sleazy radio presenter whilst being told to leave the country.
Why don't you like living in this country?
Why don't I like living in this country?
Because I think, you know...
Why do you live in this country? Why don't you live somewhere else? Seriously.
Like I said, where would I go that Britain hasn't devastated?
I don't
And a real question, Jamaica
devastated.
Nigeria devastated, Ghana devastated. Where would I go that Britain hasn't devastated?
Every single part of planet Earth.
Every single part where black people live, yes.
Right.
One year, the BBC did a segment called Churchill, Hero or Villain, where two historians discussed the highs and lows of Churchill's career and concluded with something like,
He is the most biographed person in history because he's a little bit of both.
So that's a fairly nuanced take that anyone could get behind, right? Fuck no. You see, if you think of Churchill as anything less than a hero, then That's a problem for quite a few people.
And I'm not saying that we should feel ashamed.
I
I'm
get
saying there are facts that we suppress
Right.
because we're not comfortable with them. And when we raise facts,
It's not a
Piers,
zero-sum
people
game.
attack you and say that you're
Actually, you
unpatriotic
know what?
and you hate this
You
country.
know what? It is a zero-sum game. Winston Churchill is a hero.
Well, personally, I won't stand for this hyper-offended snowflakery. I intend to pursue the truth, wherever my internet search history may lead. The thing that interests me here is the reactions you get from people when you talk about Churchill's shortcomings. Often they'll just agree with you, but then argue that he deserves a pass because he defeated the Nazis. We all have flaws after all, and that's true. If by flaws you mean we've all negligently allowed 3 million Bengalis to starve to death whilst insisting that it was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. But for others, the idea that we can appreciate Churchill for the war and criticize him for just about everything else isn't good enough. And for these people, even at his worst, Churchill is simply misunderstood. And occasionally, there's a bit of truth in this. For example, when he was Home Secretary in 1910, there's the story that he sent national troops in to deal with striking Welsh miners in Tonypandy, a move which resulted in one miner being killed. There's a quote from his cabinet meeting before the event which goes, "If the Welsh are striking over hunger, then we must fill their bellies with lead." That quote is made up, in fact. He didn't say that, and the killing that happened was in a clash with the police before the troops had even arrived. Obviously, the Welsh were right to resent him for sending in troops, and it was a decision that Churchill himself openly regretted. I also found out that the original memo which shows his reluctance to use military force was auctioned for £1,500, which is kind of weird, like someone paid that much for the evidence that he did send troops in, but he felt bad about it. Anyway, there are people on the left who tell that story like he had ordered the military to fire on miners and that was why someone died, so I just thought I'd make that correction. Right, both sides. We did it. But then, of course, there are other defenses of Churchill that are just mind-blowing. My favourite one comes from the Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, seen here looking like a reanimated Victorian tadpole, can't argue from feelings because he has none. If anyone could give us a cold, dispassionate defence of Churchill, it would be him. And on BBC Question Time, when Grace Blakely brought up Churchill's role as a war correspondent during the Second Boer War in South Africa, I remember thinking, oh shit, he's gonna bring up some esoteric details that get Churchill off the hook. But instead, the exchange went like this.
The superiority of the race, or the concentration camps, or the Kenyan gulags?
The concentration camps, the South African concentration camps had exactly the same mortality rate as existed in Glasgow at the time. So they're not a good thing, but where else were people going to live when there was all that war?
Did you just justify the use of concentration camps?
No, I didn't. I'm talking about the Boer War had people put in camps for their protection.
Where the British invented the use of concentration camps.
But I'm afraid you're confusing concentration camps with Hitler's extermination camps.
I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm saying that any concentration camp is de facto an awful, awful thing.
These were people who were interned for their safety. Now, that is not a good thing. I'm not in favour.
Hundreds of thousands of people died.
The death rate was exactly the same as in Glasgow. Death rates 100 years ago were considerably higher than they are now for all sorts of reasons, including...
It was systematic murder.
It was not systematic murder. That's simply wrong. I'm not advocating people being taken off their farms and put into camps, but there was a war going on, and people were being taken there so they could be fed because the farmers were away fighting the Boer War. So this is one of the things where you've got to understand the history of what was going on, not just look at it from the comfort of 2019 and say that this is the same as what was going on with Hitler. It is completely and utterly different, simply wrong to lie to say.
Jacob Rees-Mogg there showing us all the true value of a world-class education. Incidentally, he's lying about pretty much everything. Let's look at the first claim, that they were interned for their protection. And I know a better YouTuber would keep this short, but f*** you, we're learning about the Second Boer War. So, the Boers were a group of Dutch settlers who lived in South Africa through the 18th and 19th century. The word Boer, which is Dutch for farmer, was the name given to them after they had been forced to live north of the Cape by the British Empire. In 1899, the Second Boer War was a fairly unfamiliar war for the British. And not just because the enemy also had guns this time, but because it was mostly a guerrilla war. The Boer armies were defeated fairly quickly in the field, and the British then moved on to occupy their two capital cities. By the end of 1900, Field Marshal Roberts declared the war to be over and left the country, handing power over to his second-in-command, Lord Kitchener. However, after the Boers started launching a series of hit-and-run attacks on British troops, it became clear that the war hadn't been won yet. Kitchener, who wasn't used to fighting on these terms, was faced with a problem. As the occupiers, they were in relatively unknown territory and they were surrounded by Boer civilians. Most of the surrounding farmland was occupied by the wives and children of Boer fighters, and the British would eventually learn that the guerrilla fighters had been moving between these farms and relying on them for food and information. Kitchener's strategy was to burn down the farms. By the end of the year, at least 8 towns were completely destroyed, and thousands of Boer women and children were made homeless. In July 1900, the first camp was set up. It was initially meant to be a shelter for the families of Boers who had surrendered, but it was also used to hold people whose husbands and fathers were still fighting. And by 1901, over 100,000 people were detained across 34 camps, surrounded by barbed wire and ringed with blockhouses. This was the first time the term concentration camp would be used in the English language. When the term was first brought up in Parliament, the Secretary of War assured the House of Commons that Lord Kitchener had been taking every possible step to make sure that all refugees were treated humanely. At the same time, a young Winston Churchill wrote in the Times that the camps involved the minimum of suffering. It wasn't until Emily Hobhouse, a British feminist and welfare campaigner, visited them when the conditions of the camps became public knowledge. The families had been crammed into small tents that were unbearably hot by day and soaking wet at night. The water they drank was never boiled and came out of a nearby river which had become contaminated with raw sewage, and diseases like typhoid, dysentery, measles, pneumonia, and bronchitis were endemic. There are people who would argue that this was beyond the control of British officers, but to say that they were off the hook is simply false. The British overseers had also made it an official policy to give extra food rations to the families of those who had surrendered. Those extra rations came from the families of those who were still fighting, and by the time Hobhouse arrived, people were starving to death. This wasn't even to mention the 40,000 black Africans who were being held in camps, only in their case, with less food and no tents. The minimum of suffering. Unfortunately, Hobhouse's reports didn't do much to change the views of people at home. The British, who had become accustomed to winning wars quickly and easily, had a growing disdain for the Boers who, themselves, were not above killing civilians when it suited them. And as per the dehumanization associated with concentration camps, one British author, Lady Maud Ralston, had this to say about the Boers. "I can only say that I much dislike their aspect. Their countenances are singularly deficient in nobility. Their eyes are generally small and dark, and are very close together. The nose is short and insignificant. The drooping moustache, which usually conceals the upper lip, shows the lower one to be large and sensual. The face is, to my thinking, nearly always animal. The glance is shifty, and reminds me irresistibly of a visit to the zoological gardens at home." Decades before the Nazis would become known for it, it was also common for British officials to blame interned parents for the deaths of their children. In his own words, Lord Kitchener believed that tens of thousands of children had died to the criminal neglect of their mothers, arguing that some of them ought to be tried for manslaughter. By the end of the war in 1902, 42,000 people had died in the camps, and the vast majority of them were under the age of 16. Kitchener would later become famous for having his picture on the recruitment posters in World War I. If the UN definition is anything to go by, this would have been classed as a genocide. But moving on to the second claim.
The South African concentration camps had exactly the same mortality rate as existed in Glasgow at the time.
So the death rate in South African concentration camps was the same as in Glasgow. Let's look at that. Here he's most likely referring to the Glasgow health crisis, which in 1900 had also coincided with a small outbreak of the bubonic plague. Just a fun fact, the so-called Glasgow effect relating to the city's famously low life expectancy took a really long time to go away. In the early 2000s, the male life expectancy in Carlton, a small borough in Glasgow, was 54, over 10 years lower than that in the Gaza Strip or in Iraq during the war, so love that. I should also correct Grace's claim that hundreds of thousands of people died. In fact, there were about 150,000 people interned during the Boer War, of which 42,000 died in the space of 2 years. But that's an alarmingly high death rate, averaging at about 280 per thousand. Was it really also that high in Glasgow? No. The bubonic plague did wipe out about a third of Europe's population, but that was quite a while ago. During the Glasgow outbreak, only 16 people died. According to the National Records of Scotland, just over 16,000 people died in Glasgow in 1901 from a population of 762,000, putting the death rate at just over 20 per thousand at the peak of the health crisis. The year after, around 15,000 died. And this is where I'm kind of stunned. It's not even like he's confused absolute deaths with deaths per thousand, he's just wrong in every possible way. And the strangest thing is, he didn't need to defend any of this. Churchill wasn't in charge of the camps, he was a journalist. I mean, okay, he was obviously a very irresponsible journalist.
The minimum of suffering.
But the concentration camps weren't set up on his watch. This isn't Kenya in the 1950s when the camps were absolutely set up on his watch. I mean, not that. Jacob could have just been pedantic and said it wasn't Britain who invented concentration camps. The Spanish did that 5 years earlier in Cuba, we only copied them and then continued to use them for 70 years. But the reason I find this clip so interesting is that it gives us a look behind the curtain. By the time he was 18, enough money had been spent on Jacob Rees-Mogg's education to buy a family house in the suburbs. And this is what you get for it. The living embodiment of entitlement and privilege, lying through his teeth because he found himself on the back foot against a 20-something left-wing woman. Defending genocide when no one needed him to. The fact that Churchill just happened to be around at the time was enough to make it worth defending. In The Politics, there's a bit where Aristotle talks about how you can't have political authority without majesty. For some people, it's not enough for Churchill to be the man who was good at winning wars but terrible at everything else. He needs to be an idol, and his critics need to be the uninformed rabble. And if Grace hadn't been there to push back, the audience would have only heard that side of it. That the camps were there to keep people safe, and that was it. And if anyone was dying, it was no worse than it was in Glasgow. I looked all over the place and I still have no idea where he got that claim from. What was his source? Was it Churchill's journalism? Wait, was it?